Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Jennifer and today we're going to talk about servant leadership. Really, here are 3 mistakes that I made when implementing servant leadership. So what is servant leadership? Well, servant leadership is about serving your employees. So the traditional org structure has a leader at the top and employees at the bottom, and all these arrows going from the leader to the employees. And servant leadership flips that upside down. So now you have the employees at the top and the leader at the bottom with all the arrows pointing to the employees. So the leader is serving the employees. And here's an image that I like to think of when I get tripped up in what is really servant leadership. So think of yourself watching the Winter Olympics. You're watching a curling match. And there's a person who pushes the stone is traveling, and then there's this other person who's furiously sweeping in front of the stone. Now, that person is not touching the stone, they're not changing the stone's direction of travel. Instead, they're clearing the way for the stone to travel. They're clearing the path, they're removing obstacles, and the stone is still doing the primary work. And that's what I like to think of a servant leader. So the servant leader is sweeping, clearing obstacles, paving the way, and the employee or the stone is still continuing their direction of travel. They're still continuing on their path. So what are the mistakes that I made? Well, the 3 mistakes I made, starting with number 1. Servant leadership is not, I'll do it for you. So when an employee brings you a problem, the first thing you might want to do as a servant leader is go and fix that problem for the employee. But that might not be the right thing to do. The goal of servant leadership is to remove obstacles and barriers from the employee's path as they are executing their work. So when an employee encounters a problem and they bring it to you, your first instinct might be, well, my job is to serve, so I'm going to go do and fix that problem for them and move them ahead in their journey. But that's not what you want to do. Instead, you do want to barrier bust. You want to help the employee remove that obstacle. But here's the key. You want the employee to still do the work. So instead of doing it for the employee, instead remove the obstacle so that the employee can continue on with their work. And Robert Greenleaf, who's the founder of servant leadership back in 1970, said that the key method to servant leadership is that the employee is still growing. And growth requires friction. So if there's no friction for the employee, then they're not really growing, they're not becoming more autonomous. And you need them to execute the work themselves while you're just removing barriers from their path ahead of them. So that's lesson number 1. Servant leadership is not, I'll do it for you. Okay, so the second mistake is servant leadership is not, I'll lower my expectations. So as a leader, as a manager, you've probably set some pretty lofty goals. And now the employees are trying to meet those goals, and it's hard. I mean, if it was easy, you guys would have already done it, and you wouldn't have set it as a big goal. So now the employee's encountering some resistance. They're trying to execute against the goal, and they bring it to you. As a servant leader, they might ask you, let's change the goal. The goal's too hard. Let's lower the expectation. And that's not what servant leadership is about. Instead, servant leadership is taking the employee through the process of achieving the goal. And that means that there's going to be friction and it's going to be hard work, but the employee still has to execute against the goal. Now you can give the employee tools and you can help remove barriers, but it's not about lowering the expectation because that doesn't do anyone a service. I mean, if you've decided this goal is paramount to your success, then you're only harming everyone if you lower the expectations or if you reduce the goal in order to make it easier for the employee. So instead, keep focusing on how do I remove obstacles from this employee's path and not how do I change the end line for the employee. Okay, the third mistake here is servant leadership is not, I'll intervene all the time. This was the hardest lesson for me to learn. Okay, so let's say you've got two different teams and they have a conflict. And as a servant leader, this looks like an obstacle in their path to executing their work. And so you might be tempted to intervene and mediate this problem between the two teams. But that's not what servant leadership is about. I'll tell you a story. I had two teams. They had a conflict with each other and they were on opposite rotation. So it was difficult for them to work together or solve the conflict together because they were only there for like 30 minutes at the same time. And so they asked me to basically fix this problem for them and prevent them from having this as an issue in the future. And I did that. So I intervened and I said, okay, here's what we're going to do. And I solved the problem by being a mediator between the two teams. But here is the issue with that approach. For one, it eroded the trust between the two teams. I could have had an opportunity to have them work together, come up with a better decision than I would have come up with as a leader, and then they'd both be bought into that decision and go execute it. But instead, I decreed what they were going to do, and that eroded the trust between them, and it eroded the trust between them and me. And thirdly, it set this precedent that I would be the mediator. So next thing I know, I've got people coming to me for interpersonal conflicts, for more inter-team conflicts, and I had become the chief mediator of the group. And that's really unsustainable. So as a servant leader, what I should have done in that situation is give them the tools to solve the problem themselves. Teach them about conflict resolution, hold true that conflict should be resolved between the two parties at hand, and not bringing in a third outside party because that doesn't help anyone move forward. Really, we're giving the employee these conflict resolution tools that will help them throughout their entire career. It's not about solving today's problem, it's about giving them the tools to be successful. And so sometimes I would get really caught up in, but I want to do something. I want to help in some way. And so if you're feeling that, here's what I'd encourage you to do. Go out to the employee that's having the conflict and say, hey, I'll take over your station, your work, while you go and solve the conflict with the other party. So they're still having to do the work of conflict resolution, but you can feel like you're adding value to the situation. I think that's the big compromise there. Don't do the work for the employee. Give them the tool and then let them resolve the conflict on their own without your intervention, because you don't want to be stuck as a mediator between two parties, between two teams, between anybody really in your position of servant leadership. So those are the 3 mistakes that I made when trying to implement servant leadership, and hope that you've learned from these mistakes and maybe you can avoid them in your leadership journey. Thanks for watching.